Excellent.
Okay.
On the B, we'll just do a slower pace.
Okay, sure. Here we go. The principal change to impact the crew, however, came in the form of a new commanding officer, Captain Leslie Edward Garys. He'd assumed command at Ulithi the previous November. Garys was physically a big man.
You know, it's really a privilege to be involved with a documentary about the USS Franklin. Like a lot of old-time Marines, I've got an anchor tattooed on my ass. I've spent a lot of time at sea, a lot of time aboard those Hayes Gray hotels and the amphibious fleets, and you somehow just sort of by osmosis, you pick up stories especially about World War II in the Pacific, which was such a naval war, such a naval campaign. And the Franklin was something that I'd always been fascinated by. She was known throughout the fleet and the Fleet Marine Force as the ship that wouldn't die. I'd actually talked to a couple of Marines who were survivors of the Franklin who'd been in her Marine detachment. And so I was kind of fascinated by the story. And then producer Joe Small and producer-director Rob Childs come to me and say, look, how about if you use your dulcet tones to tell the Franklin story? And I said, sure, absolutely, glad to do it. It resonates right in my ballpark of getting military history out to a popular audience, and so I was delighted to do that. And then Rob sent me the copy written by Joe Springer, a historian that I have a lot of respect for, who's studied the Franklin for years and years and years. And what came of it is this story of how the crew was maligned, essentially, mistreated, threatened with court-martial for essentially abandoning ship when she was burning and adrift and almost cold iron and under constant attack, and there was nothing else they could do. I didn't know that story. And so I began to hear in cuts and interviews with Franklin survivors these stories of being faced with absolutely no place else to go. In other words, it was either go over the side 90 feet off the flight deck into the water or die. There was just no other option. Your back was up against the bulkhead, so to speak. That was perfectly understandable to me. What wasn't understandable to me was the action of her skipper, Captain Garys, who literally threatened these people with desertion under fire, which is a heinous wartime crime. The possible sentence, if you're convicted by court-martial, is death. And I looked at that and said, my God, why hasn't this story been told? I mean, this is the heart of the Franklin story. We've all seen Father Joe O'Callahan doing the last rites over that sailor on the flight deck, and that's iconic. It's almost as iconic in World War II imagery and history as is the flag raising on Mount Suribachi in Marine Corps World War II history. So I was always fascinated by that image, and I had studied it and knew it came from the Franklin, but I had no idea, for instance, that Father Joe O'Callahan, the man who was doing the last rites there on the flight deck in that iconic image, had turned down the Navy Cross because he knew that he'd been recommended for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award. So as I began to look through the story, and as Rob and Joe kept sending me more and more material, this thing was peeling like an onion. I was seeing more and more and more of a really, really important story in naval history, and one which hadn't been told. So they had to throw a 2-inch heaving line on me to keep me from charging right down here to the studio and helping to put this together.